Dr. Don Russo, and this is Rabbi Gadi Capella. Just to reacquaint you, and if you are new to this group, we are it right now. So what I'd like to do is just briefly review very quickly what we've done in the first two sessions. We started talking about the Second Vatican Council, which was a council of the Roman Catholic Church, participated in by all the bishops of the world. There were about 2,600 of them. Vatican Council II extended from 1962 through 1965 with 4 sessions. Sessions usually went from September or October to December. What was interesting about this council, there were 21 of them, and this was the 21st council in the history of the church. The uniqueness of this council is very much taken up in the language of the council itself. This council came together, and it was the first one in the history of the church that did not come together to condemn doctrine or to place blame on certain people. It was a very, very pastoral council, very much open to the world. It was the brainchild of Pope John the 23rd, who called the council just about 3 months after he was elected Pope in 1959. And basically he wanted to throw the doors and windows open, let some fresh air into the church after so many centuries. And his main word in that opening was aggiornamento, to bring the church up to date. Just to be very, very brief, the council produced, over the 4 years, produced 16 documents. Four constitutions, which were the most important documents, 9 decrees, and what does that leave us? 4
constitutions.
4 declarations. We decided that we were going to look at Vatican Council II in its opening of the doors to the question of interfaith friendships, because that's exactly what Pope John wanted initially. He wanted closer relationship with the Jews. He wanted basically to bring about the unity of the Christian churches. So we took 2 of the documents. One was a decree on ecumenism. Ecumenism is the movement to bring about Christian unity. We haven't touched on that one yet. We began with one of the declarations on the church's relationship to non-Christian religions, the Latin name of which was Nostra Aetate. In English, that means in our time. So, excuse me, we began talking and looking at the implications of this declaration on non-Christian religions, primarily because the longest section of this document is on the Jews and was meant to be. The document covered Hinduism, Buddhism, and other Eastern religions, and also Islam. But its primary focus throughout the history of the council itself was the relationship between the church and the Jewish people. So up to this point, we've been speaking about the implications and the meaning of this document, Nostra Aetate. So we will continue in that vein, although today what we might do is to branch off a little bit to see what's been going on in the world regarding Christian-Jewish relationships. Gotti, you want to throw anything else in there?
So also what we've been talking about is how we are a product, our conversation is a product of the same event in the 60s. I wouldn't have been able to do my work with Father Roy or with Don, and even having these conversations, especially when I was come from the Orthodox stream of Judaism at the time. So the fact that the church opened that door for relationship, and I think the most important thing was to lift off the burden from Jews that they are responsible for killing Jesus. I mean, that was basically the point. So once the church declared that, then even when Christians and even maybe Christian clergy would want to continue with this rhetoric, they really couldn't, and that really eased the pressure on both sides. I have to say that it didn't necessarily on the Jewish side. I think the effect was took longer to take effect, and for me I studied a lot of time, for many years, but Judaism, but never really touched upon Christianity until I met people personally. And I think what Don is talking about, that when the church changed its rhetoric about Jews, it hoped, and other faith, it hoped that it will trickle down to the people on the street. And I think that's where we are now. And for many years, it really still stayed in the kind of ivory towers, right, of universities and seminaries. But it really is now, there's the whole phenomenon of being able to speak to each other. And that's really where we are today. And that whole idea of supersessionism in versus the Jews may not believe in Christ or the divinity of Jesus, but they are still faithful to God, to their original covenant, and that is a big credit that the church gave the Jews. So there was it opened the door for this conversation to happen. The document Nostra Aetate, the promulgation of which reversed, I would say, centuries of Catholic and papal. It reversed that Catholic and papal anti-Semitism, and that was earth-shattering with regard to the church. It kind of reversed it. It stamped out, as best it could, the fact that, number one, Christianity somehow superseded, when Gotti used the word supersessionism, that somehow Christianity superseded the old covenant and was the only valid covenant to speak of now. And what the council did, and by the way, there were centuries of misinterpretations of scriptures, concepts and understanding of Jews that really worked to the detriment of any relationship between the church and Judaism. But thank God we have
turned the tide at this point in the relationship between Jews and Christians. It opened a dialogue between the two religions. And one of the things it did was to make sure that people understood that all of the misinterpretations of Scripture, which we had followed for centuries, were now, with the new movements in Scripture studies and scholarship, we now understand that all of those Scripture interpretations that brought about anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism have now been reinterpreted and rescinded. And obviously it involved growth, and it involved change. And fortunately there are some who are open to change. To change is a very mature process, but it's also it's a process that demands a lot of humility.
Yeah, and also the process itself was not just about being friends. Being friends, you know, Jews and Christians have been friends for many centuries. But it really is on the theological level, in churches and synagogues. How do we deal with each other? So on the Jewish side, for example, the determination if Christianity this is a conversation that's been going on for centuries. Is the Trinity considered a valid, in a sense, faith or not? And if it's not a valid faith, which means that if it crosses the line of the unity of God from our perspective, then there's actually legal ramifications from the Jewish perspective. I can give an example from, let's say, how you deal with faith that you consider, let's say, idol worshiping, right? So you can't do business with people that you think are idol worshiping, or their faith is directly opposing the unity of God. But we actually see that over the years, Judaism did not treat Christianity on the ground like this, because it did do business with Christians. It did, respect their tradition. So they may not liked it, but they respected it. But that process continued to the people in the synagogues and the churches. And this is where we are, I think, now, when we were not before.
And to add to that, there were, for centuries, the church held the idea that outside of the church there was no salvation. And Vatican II began to really deal with that question from a deeper point of view. Not to get into a theological discussion right now, because it's a discussion that is going on among scholars, scripture scholars, theologians, and so on. But it seems to me that the key word in the theological relationship between Jews and Christians is the word salvation. All right? What does the word salvation mean? And as one author put it, everybody knows what salvation means until they're asked to explain it. Okay?
Can you elaborate on that? On what it meant, salvation, in the sense that Jews can be also part of that, even though they don't go through the divinity of Jesus?
Well, I think originally the context was, if you don't belong to the church, somehow you would not be saved. You would not, I guess in layman's terms, get to heaven. And we began to see, as I said, with the openings to that that is no longer considered to be a valid position. What Vatican II did, it opened the door to saying that there is truth in all of these other religions, and that, for example, the Jews in following the Torah, and this was the way God spoke and was to save them, okay? So Vatican II really opens up the door.
So in a sense, it changed the mindset that there's only one path to salvation,
Right.
and it really created more paths.
Right.
It's very interesting. You know why? Because we're now really in these days in synagogue we read about the Israelites leaving Egypt and crossing the Sea of Reeds. We just read it last Shabbat. And there's a midrash that it's an explanation, it's a teaching of the rabbis. It's not in the text, but it's an elaboration of the rabbis that said that actually each tribe had its own path within the Sea of Reeds. So they didn't just go as a whole nation, but even within the nation there was this, this subcategories of salvation, that you can find your own path. It's a very important mindset in the Jewish tradition, in a sense. Jack has a question. When he's asking when can he can ask questions.
The question is what was John the 23rd's background to make him say, I've got to do this? His background was, I would say, not professional. It was the openness to the Spirit and his own humanity that made him see what was going on and what the church really needed to do. Now remember, John the 23rd was supposed to be an interim pope. I mean, he was elected when he was very old, and he had just been elected after Pius XII had, I don't know how many, 20 plus years of papacy. And John the 23rd was elected pretty much to just keep the reins going until they could really elect a new pope who would kind of last much longer. But as John himself said, he was even surprised when he made the announcement of the council. All right? That somehow he felt that this movement of the Spirit had moved him to the point that it just came to him. Call it a vision, call it a discernment, but that's where it all started.
Yeah, I would also, of course, add that he came after
Pius XII.
Right, Pius XII, who was the Pope during the Holocaust. So he's really the first opportunity, right, for a Pope to really examine what happened when the church for many centuries, I don't think it intended to create a Holocaust, but the rhetoric of the church did not help.
What year is
1963. Well,
the Pope was
1959.
The Pope was elected in 1959, and he announced in 1959 he announced this council, which was to begin in 1962. He only lived a year through the council. His successor was Pope Paul VI, and Paul VI guided the council for the last 3 years. So John actually got to see the beginning of his dream, and then the Lord took him, and Paul VI carried on. So it ended in 1965. Okay. This idea of salvation that we were talking about, and it being a crucial word, we all have to remember that when religions speak, now I'm speaking also for the church speaks of what it knows in faith. So a lot of the church statements, doctrines, and so on and so forth are faith statements. I think one of the things we have to remember is that human beings have this tendency to want to control. So even in matters of faith, people ironically call themselves people of faith, and yet the one thing they want is certainty. And the two just don't go hand in hand. We don't know the myriad ways that God somehow saves people. All right? The church has its own faith statements. And don't forget the idea of religion, at least one idea of religion, which I learned, was that religion is a way to interpret reality. And interestingly enough, religion and science both have the same purpose. Science is meant to explain reality. Religion is meant to explain reality. But they do it in different ways. Of course, science uses measurement to interpret, but faith uses a filter. All visions of faith, religions, and reality is seen through a particular filter. For Christians, we're called Christians because we believe in the risen Christ. So a Christian's way of interpreting reality will always be filtered through their belief and faith in the risen Christ. So that filter is very, very important. And religions have different filters in their faith to interpret the reality. Okay? And once you begin to interpret reality through that filter, you speak of I hate to make the distinction, but you speak of religious ways of living out your life in identifying yourself and so on. So that's where the idea of salvation is now coming to play. What does it mean? And we'll let the theologians deal with that.
And I would add an important aspect that we have spoken together about many times, that what happened also pre-Second Vatican Council and the whole Holocaust, Second World War, is that the elimination of the Jews moved from faith to their ethnicity. And once it became a racial thing or ethnic thing, then I think even the argument that the church may have had, right or wrong, that Jews could not be in the salvation unless they go through Jesus. But once Europe took it to the ethnicity, I think it kind of broke all the rules. And then the church had to react to that, because they never said that Jews are condemned, even though it condemned Jews over the years, but never on a racial basis. It was never because they were born Jewish. Hence the Inquisition, has the forced conversion. If someone is born already condemned, then how can you convert them? But it wasn't about that. But once it went there, then the church had to had to respond to that. And I would compare it to the salvation of the Jews the Hebrews in Egypt. Because the prophecy to Abraham was already that his children, God tells Abraham, your children are going to be enslaved for 400 years. And then they'll come out free. It didn't say which nation will do that. It ended up being Egypt. But that was already a prophecy. So God somehow put it in the journey of the Jews somehow to, I don't know what that, part of the education, part of the, whatever that means. I think it was meant to imprint in us that we were slaves. Therefore, from now on, for the rest of human history, you need to be the watchdog of tyranny. And definitely not make yourself a tyrant, a pharaoh. But once Pharaoh took an extra step and started throwing the Hebrew children into the Nile, God never said that they will kill them. Said that they will work them hard, but not to kill them. So once that Pharaoh took that leap, God had to respond and took to bring salvation. And that, I see the parallel in what happened in Second Vatican Council. It just was taken too far, and the church had to respond.
And the church definitely had to respond to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. And what had happened, even though there had been anti-Judaism based on the religion of the Jews in Christian understanding that they were Christ killers, they used the word deicide, the killing of God, and a lot of this took place because, as I said earlier, a misinterpretation of the scriptures. Once Nazism and Adolf Hitler came on the scene, the idea of the extermination of the Jews was based on, as Gotti said, the fact that the Jews were not just, Judaism was not just a religion, but it was a race. And so that was what brought in there, the idea of racism and nationalism, which brought about the horrors of the Holocaust.
Because if you think about it, what we're talking about is expanding, right? Like you were saying, even expanding the idea of salvation, that it's not as narrow definition as possible. And what the Nazis did, they made in their own way, of course it wasn't a religious salvation, but they made the criteria so narrow that it was a compilation of nationalism and racial identity. Then it was so narrow and it really affected everybody. So that, I think, had to be countered.
Right. And Vatican II, again, one of the reasons it was called was to counter the Holocaust, to counter the Shoah. But it was also very touchy because taking place during the 1960s, you also had, it was very interesting, you also had the bishops in the Middle East pleading not to make too many concessions to the Jews because they were living in Muslim countries. And it would make the relationships very, very tentative and very dangerous. Pope John just said, listen, we're going to move on. This is the right thing to do. And with all of the turmoils that we find, the Arab-Jewish conflicts in the 60s and so on, this is the context in which Vatican II was called and carried on. So it was a very, very important moment. In fact, theologians would say today, many of them would, that because of the Holocaust, theology and one's understanding of God had to change. In other words, theology now has to be dealt with in the modern age with a mind to what happened during the Holocaust. Because obviously the traditional understandings of God, at least the doctrinal understandings of God, sometimes the scriptural understandings of God, were shaken. We're shaken. The Jews survived, yes, but they lost again.
Yeah. I think it went to the core of the image of God in a human being. So the Holocaust took it so far as to really try to eliminate even that. And for religious institutions, as much as they wanted to condemn other faith, but once a group of people took that conversation to the level of the erasing the image of God in a person, then that I think they couldn't stand for.
Just to kind of move on to emphasize this idea of the relationship of the church and the Shoah, the Holocaust, there was a document printed, a document that came out in 1998 called, it was produced by a Catholic Commission for the Religious Relations with the Jews. And it was called We Remember, a reflection on the Shoah. And I think it's important for us to see now, this was 30 years after the council, the great reflection upon and understanding of how devastating the Shoah was and how sometimes complicit Christians were in augmenting the horrors of the Shoah. So,
but when let's say preachers were quoting the New Testament and the word Jews in the New Testament didn't have to necessarily mean the Jews that live today, but somehow they maybe, I don't know how much they made the effort of separating the Jews of the time of Jesus and contemporary Jews. And once the council made that disconnected those two aspects and said, we're not holding the Jews that live today as the killers of Christ, that made that is the opening. That is, I see as the opening.
And it was not even the Jews of today, but it basically said the Jewish people were not responsible for the death of Jesus. All right, the Jewish people as a whole, and that was to extend. Yes, there were Jews and Romans involved, and these small groups who were involved in the actual passion and death of Jesus, but Jews as a whole were not to be blamed. Right?
I have a question actually in terms of, this is clearly like rewriting the contract or the relationship between Jews and Catholics. Was there anything before that in other councils that an attempt ever to formalize the relationship
on a positive level?
On a positive level,
no.
or not even on a positive level?
No,
but make it an official document.
No, I think that first of all, that's what made Vatican II unique. That this was the first time it spoke in a positive way about the relationship about the Jewish people and its relationship to the church. Any statements, and there were statements as Pius IX, Pius X, made very denigrating statements about the Jews. But as far as councils were usually called to defend the church, to defend the doctrine of the church in some way, shape, or form, by condemning certain positions or redefining certain doctrines. This council did not do that.
And I find it very interesting because from the Torah's perspective, the Jewish perspective, legally, to have a real contract, you have to have the negative side and the positive side. Otherwise, it's not a legal document. So, for example, when God tells the Jewish people, if you do that, I'll respond in this way. But if you don't, I'll respond in this way. Right? When you sign a lease with a landlord, the lease says, okay, you have to pay $1,000 a month to rent this place. But if you don't pay the $1,000, the consequences. And I think in that sense, it kind of mimicked a real contract. Because it says the negative, right? It responded to the negative, and then it had a positive aspect too. It's not just that the Jews are not Christ killers, but they are also respected for holding to the tradition, to the relationship with God, to be the elder in the faith, right, that we are, in positive effect. So it's in that sense that I find it really like the church signed a contract with kind of itself, right, but projecting to the other faith.
Right. And I would just to show you now, as I said, this was 30 years after the council, but in this document, I just want to go over a couple of interesting points that come up. And now remember, this focused on the Holocaust, the Shoah itself. The church has a special obligation to reflect on this horrible genocide by reason of her very close bonds of spiritual kinship with the Jewish people and of her remembrance of the injustices of the past. So there is this obligation to really reflect on the Holocaust and the effect it's had on the Jewish people because of this now living relationship between Catholics and Jews. The Shoah took place in Europe, countries of long-standing Christian civilization. So you have to realize that the Holocaust grew up in Christian Europe. And there were many Christians who either weren't strong enough, prophetic enough to speak out, and yet there were many Christians who followed Hitler and went along with what he said.
Yeah, actually, when you go to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, the Yad Vashem, the National Holocaust Museum in Israel, when you enter, there's a kind of you go through a track, and it's like room by room, and it kind of leads you into the progression, the historical progression. And actually, the first room deals with Nazism. I mean, it's really very interesting that when you enter, of course, Nazism, but the church, the root of Nazism in the church. That's the first room that you enter, is that connection. That all these centuries of negative rhetoric against the Jews manifested itself, ironically, even through a very secular government.
And the same is true if you've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. The interesting thing about that is that when you go in, you go to the top floor. So basically what you're doing as you're going through the museum, you're starting at the top floor and wending your way down in kind of a semicircular or a circular fashion to the bottom. And interestingly enough, one of the first exhibits you run into, again, is focused on the Nazis, their medical people, and what you see in the display are the different skulls with the different measurements to try to determine inferior and superior races because of the size of the skull and the brain and so on and so forth. And on the same floor, you're invited to go through and sit and watch a movie of the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism. So that's where the Holocaust Museum begins. It begins with the whole focus on Nazism and its attempt to create a master race. Okay? Not only is the idea of Vatican II itself interesting in trying to close the gap between Jews and Christians, but also John the 23rd himself, given that there were other John 22nd, 23rd, during the period where there were three popes, Jack sees a parallel between the closing of the gap between Christians and Jews and John the 23rd closing the gap of this fissure that was created in the Avignon days of the church and so on. I don't know, that's the first time I've heard anyone make that connection. So,
but sometimes it's just not the number, but the name John. When they are ordained pope, they choose their name.
Right.
So why do you know why John the 23rd actually chose John? And maybe this is a clue to what he was trying to do.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Why I don't.
But what is he? Which John is he referring to? The John the Evangelist?
No. Another pope where there was a conflict in the church where there were three popes at the same time.
No, I understand that, but the name John,
well,
when he picked the name John,
that would lead me to think it was that, which I find ironic.
Or John the Baptist.
No, well, again, I don't recall. I'm sure there's a reason he chose John.
That's a nice
because
point.
The previous popes were all pious or Benedict. But in my own mind, when we raised that question, it was very interesting that it was the evangelist John, of all the evangelists, that was most accused of anti-Judaism. Because of this constant referral to the Jews. Some people have tried to translate the Greek to, instead of the Jews, to the Judeans. To let the scripture scholars deal with that. But the fact of the matter is that it was John the Evangelist who was pointed to the most as to being the most anti-Jewish of the evangelists. Now again, there's historical reasons for that.
When there's an anti-Semitic attack or something, we say it was on a racial basis. But really, we don't treat Judaism necessarily as race, but as because they're black Jews, the Ethiopian Jews and others, and there's Russian Jews that are very white, but ethnicity is more of the word that we use. It's definitely in the beginning, right? It started with a family of Abraham, and then Isaac and Jacob and the Israel family was definitely they were an ethnic group. They came from a certain place, right? They didn't come from I don't know, Alaska. They came from a place in the Middle East. So there's definitely the ethnicity. Not a race, it's ethnicity. I know it's a very fine line, but when you say today, at least, the word race is very loaded. I used it once in a summer camp, and one of the girls in the camp was outraged that I even used the word race in reference to Judaism, to Jews. But what I really meant to say was that it was an ethnic group. That's for sure. Nobody would argue that. Later on, of course, it's like a family that has in-laws, that marries, many people. So, the beginning of Judaism is definitely an ethnic group, but it's not there anymore. I mean, of course, most Jews are descendants of this ethnic group, but they married for many centuries now other people, and they lived among other nations, so they don't look the same. You know what I mean? Unless you were in a time capsule, like my family was in Yemen for 2,500 years. So we kind of look alike, but many Jews, traveled a lot or lived in different places and had to move because of pogroms and other things. So it's hard we don't say anymore that Judaism is a race, because also that's what the Germans tried to do, the Nazis tried to do. The what?
No.
No, definitely Christians are definitely not a race, because it was about the baptism. It wasn't about the birth. It's about baptism. So that anybody can enter that covenant. But even the Jewish covenant, you can get into the Israel covenant even if you weren't born Jewish. That's definitely not an issue. And also we say that with the Hebrews that left Egypt, the Torah tells us there were multitudes of people who left with them, because Egypt didn't just enslave the Hebrews, it enslaved, it was a house of slavery. So it enslaved many nations. So there were people who left with the Hebrews that wanted to leave. So when the Hebrews already stood in Mount Sinai, in the first covenant as a nation with God in Sinai, they were already comprised of not just Hebrews, but multitude of people. So we don't say the Jews are race, but they are an ethnic group, that came out of Egypt, and then they married many people, and they lived in many places in the world. So yeah, the origin is an ethnic group. I wouldn't say a race, because a race would then include, let's say, all the Semitic people, right? Even if you want to go there. I'll tell you a midrash, the teaching of the rabbis. They say that the three sons of Noah, however you want to look at it, even if you want to take it metaphorically, that they came out of the ark. There were three sons of Noah: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These three names refer to the three continents that were in our story, at least. America was not part of that story, but there was definitely Africa, Asia, and Europe. So the three sons of Noah are those three continents, and they're three races. The Ham is in Hebrew means hot, Ham. So it's the African continent. Japheth means like Jaffa, the city is beautiful. So it's a culture of beauty, architecture, and they were referred to as the Europeans. And then Shem means a name, and that's the Semite people, right? So the Semite people are they're not black and they're not white. So we have black in Africa, white in Europe, and the Semites in Asia are not black or white. So if you want to say, like when we refer to the term anti-Semitism, it's not that accurate, because you should say it's anti-Jews. Because when you say anti-Semitism, then Arabs are Semite too. So that's where you get into those definitions. So Jews are not a race, definitely not at this point, and never been an exclusive race. It was an ethnic group within a race. You can maybe say that. No, the popes never treated the Jews as race. And that was the point that we emphasized earlier, that when the Nazis took that rhetoric into racial thing, that you're born a Jew, and it doesn't matter. Even if you're quarter Jew, we don't even want that blood in our midst, right? That's racial. But popes never treated Jews as a racial, or they knew that they were ethnic group, but that wasn't the issue with them. It was their faith. It's because they resist to take the path of salvation through the gate of Jesus Christ. And that's really is the point. And this is exactly what we're here to do, to explain those nuances. Thank you for your question. So we're almost out of time. We want to introduce our next level of lectures, a new series of lectures. We're part of the Greenport Ecumenical Ministry here locally. And I have to say, I want to refer to what happened in Texas last week in the hostage situation in the synagogue in Beth Israel congregation, because it shed light on or congregation in small towns. And we are a congregation in a small town, and the amazing work that people do in small towns. And it apparently the Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker was very involved in ecumenism and interfaith, and actually the healing service that they did just 3 days later was at a local church. So it really shed light on how important the work in small places like ours, what we're doing. So the Greenport Ecumenical Ministries is all the ministries, not all, but many of the reverends and the priests in our area, that we get together at least once, it used to be once a month. We do basically, I would say, on a monthly basis. And we share our experiences and teachings and so forth. And what we want to do is we want to take this the Second Vatican Council, the fruits of the Second Vatican Council forward, in a sense that we want to host every month a minister or a priest, reverend from each church, each denomination, Christian denomination, that is in the Greenport area, to explain first about their own, what makes their own faith unique, and why are they Methodist and they're not Lutheran, and so forth. And then also maybe reflect historically how the Second Vatican Council changed since the Catholic Church changed its direction, how it affected their denomination. So this is what is coming up. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Not to elaborate, just so what we really need to do first is to look at the decree on ecumenism and give you a brief outline of what that was saying, why that was so important and so powerful. So next time through, we will take on that document of Vatican II and begin to explain and pinpoint certain important elements to it. Further down the line, hopefully maybe, if not the following month, the month after that, we begin to bring in Christians, since ecumenism tends more towards the idea of Christian unity. We'd like to bring in the representatives from different Christian denominations so that you and people watching would get a certain idea and understanding of what makes each denomination sui generis, if you will.